Are you one of those people who absolutely hate LeetCode? Well, this video is exactly for you because I'm going to be sharing how I got an internship at Meta and a full-time job offer at Adobe and HubSpot without applying any knowledge of data structures and algorithms. But before we get into the video, I've noticed that a lot of you guys are watching the video but are not subscribed to the channel. Please subscribe. Well, most of you must be thinking, is this clickbait? Because how can you get a job at a big tech company without practicing data structures and algorithms and doing 2 million LeetCode questions? Well, the cool thing about software development is that it has a lot of subdomains, and one of them happens to be web development. In domain-specific interviews, what companies do is that they do not ask LeetCode style questions, but rather they would ask domain style questions which would test your knowledge about the domain. For example, in web development, they could ask you web-related questions, and that is a different style of interviews compared to, the generic software engineering interviews. Now, when I started college, I started to delve deeper into web development. I learned HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Once you know the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, the other thing that you would need is a framework that lands on top of it, such as React or Angular. And of course, I can't say anything against Angular because now I work at Google, so please forgive my past videos, Google Senpai. I followed a great course called the Web Development Bootcamp by Angela, which I found on Udemy. And trust me, it's just $10, but it was the best $10 that I spent because I learned a lot about full stack development. It really solidified my concepts about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it also taught me React as well. I think if there's one course that I would recommend to you if you're of course interested in web development, then that would be the Web Development Bootcamp by Angela. So moving into third year, I did not have any major internship under my belt, and most of my work surrounded, self-initiative, working with very small startups and doing, like projects. And most of my projects, even today on my resume, were from that Web Development Bootcamp that I mentioned earlier. Now, not having a major internship and applying for, the summer internship between third and fourth year, one of the major things that really helped me with web development was that I could not only apply to front-end engineering internships, I could also apply to software engineering internships. And that is actually how I got my first internship, which was at Meta. Back then, it was called Facebook. So Meta and a lot of other companies have specific front-end engineering roles, and that was also true back then, that they had a front-end engineering internship, which I applied for. And the cool thing about the process of that was that all of the interviews surrounded knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and they were not LeetCode heavy at all. So in all of my 3 interviews, I was required to make a lot of UI changes, a lot of things involving HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, a lot of centering divs, which even after 5 years of front-end experience, I pretty much suck at that. So my first round at Meta consisted mostly of theoretical questions, and it was like back-to-back 20 questions that were asked to me. Well, what's the difference between position absolute and relative? How does JavaScript handle async stuff? And now this may sound very intimidating, but as it turns out, these are very commonly asked front-end questions. And how I prepared for them was that I just searched common front-end interview questions on YouTube, on Google, and I found out a lot of helpful links. And that is a major difference between these type of interviews, is that they rely on a lot of theoretical stuff instead of problem solving. So if you know the answer to the question, you'll pass it, but if you don't know, then you'll have a hard time. My second interview involves some div manipulation surrounding HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it is one of the easiest interviews that I gave during my internship hunt. And my third interview was also very similar. It involved HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, a bit of animation with JavaScript, like a loading bar or something like that, you could imagine. And it was not hard at all, especially if you study it beforehand. I just studied for 3 days, and I did not even know that knowledge prior to my interviews. So it turns out that getting an internship at Meta wasn't as hard as it seemed to be, especially because of my web development experiences. And now it is true that back then my LeetCode and my problem solving skills were not good at all. I was only able to land 2 internships during my internship hunt, and both of them were front-end engineering internships. And I applied to over 200 companies, and I got rejected from all my software engineering internship roles. So you can clearly see that me doing web development and me interviewing for these front-end roles really helped me to get my first major internship, which later helped me to get my full-time offer at Google as well. So this was my internship recruiting experience, but my full-time recruiting experience was also very similar for front-end engineering roles. And for example, at my interviews at Adobe, they asked me to do some UI manipulation with React.js, and it was very simple. Like, they will give you a UI which is very simple to make, and they'll be like, okay, recreate this in React. So I only had 2 interviews for a full-time front-end engineering position at Adobe, and my first interview involved, given a UI, recreate this in React. And my second interview was with the manager, and they asked me some questions regarding JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, very similar to how my first interview at Meta went. So it turns out that front-end engineering interviews are not as hard as compared to software engineering interviews, and that was true for internship positions, but it was also true for full-time positions. And I had a very similar experience at HubSpot as well, where I had 3 interviews, and all 3 of them involved some knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and they were not LeetCode styled at all. And I think that that is a great thing because it allows you to, really show your expertise in that particular domain. So maybe I can make a separate video on, some common front-end interview questions, because trust me, I searched a lot of them, I prepared a lot for them. But as it turns out, I can assure you that if you try to find some online, if you try to Google them, you will be able to prepare for it. A great thing about it is that you don't need to be the best web developer in the world, because it's a lot of theoretical stuff. Like if you even prepare when you get the interview and you have 2 weeks and you prepare well for it, I think that anyone could be able to crack it, because it's a lot of theory, it's a lot of understanding some of the fundamental concepts. And I believe that even if you're a great web developer and you get that interview call, you would still need to revise some of the stuff, because as it turns out, a lot of these things are very theory heavy, and you as a web developer, as a practical person, wouldn't even know about it until you're preparing for that interview. So in my general experience, LeetCode style interviews are like very focused on problem solving. They don't require you to have, domain specific knowledge or to know, like the specifics of a specific language. Whereas front-end interviews, you need to know JavaScript. All of your interviews are going to be in JavaScript. You need to be very comfortable with JavaScript, but it also gives you an edge because it allows you to prepare for something specific. Whereas in LeetCode style interviews, you never know which topic pattern you're gonna get. Whereas in front-end interviews, there are not a lot of patterns and topics that you can cover. So as it turns out, it's easier to cover all of these topics in a lesser time. It's easier to gain expertise with a front-end interview as compared to a LeetCode style interviews. And that is obviously from my personal experience. A lot of people will find that LeetCode style interviews suit them better. But for me, front-end interviews were the easiest amongst all of them. I think at the end, my suggestion for you would be is not to ignore either of them. If you're interested in web development, I wouldn't suggest you to not do LeetCode or to not prepare for that type of interviews. A great thing about having interest in web development is that you can actually interview for both positions. You can interview for software engineering positions, you can interview for web engineering positions. And I think that's a great advantage because it allows you to diversify the roles that you're applying for. It allows you to have better odds because you can apply to more roles, you can get more interviews, and at the end it increases your chance of landing that internship or landing that job. At the end, I think that a thing that I really enjoyed about preparing for web engineering interviews is that even during the preparation, I felt like I was learning a lot of things. I was learning a lot of things about HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and I was learning how JavaScript actually works, how CSS actually works, because previously, honestly, I had memorized all of this stuff. I didn't know how CSS display flex, how a flex box works, right? But at the end of that preparation of interviews, I actually knew the theories, I actually knew how web engineering in general works. So it was a great experience in general as a person who's also curious about learning things as well. Whereas one can say that for LeetCode style interviews, like who is gonna make you reverse a linked list at your job, right? So I think that's the one big advantage that web engineering interviews has, is that it keeps you motivated because you actually, if you're interested in web development, you would want to prepare more, you would want to learn more, and that is something that I've found truthful while I was preparing for my interviews. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I know that a lot of people don't actually know that there are front-end engineering interviews and that they're very different from the generic type of LeetCode style interviews. So I hope that this knowledge can be helpful to you. If you enjoyed the video, please like this video and of course subscribe to the channel, and as always, see you guys in the next video.